Hello and welcome to the Museum of the Shenandoah Valley. My name is Nancy Huth and I'm the Deputy Director for Arts and Education, and it's my pleasure to welcome you today to see our current exhibition, Things Come Apart. This is an exhibition that's organized by Todd McClellan and the Smithsonian Institution Traveling Exhibition Service, or SITES. So Things Come Apart is a really great exhibition for helping us to understand the insides of everyday objects. So with that, I'd kind of like to go around the corner and talk about some of the objects that have caught the eyes of a lot of our guests so far. A big theme of the exhibition is changes in technology over time, and this group of photographs I want to start with will demonstrate that. But another theme of the exhibition for a lot of us is nostalgia. So we look at an image like this, and at first it might be a little curious. What is this thing? What is it that we're looking at? But this is a disassembled turntable. And next to it is a disassembled Walkman, and across from it is a disassembled iPod. So obviously those three things really demonstrate huge changes in the technology on which we listen to music over time. But they also create this sense of nostalgia in us. We remember back to our turntable and our vinyl records. A lot of people my age and a little younger and a little older remember the Walkman and how revolutionary that seemed. And I remember when I got my iPod and questioning my husband, who said he wanted to get me one, saying to him, why would I want that? And the instant I had it, I fell in love with it and I used it all the time until the battery died. So these are three really great photographs to talk about those ideas. In the image of the turntable, you see things that very obviously look like records. You can make out the acrylic dust cover. In the Walkman, you can see the actual case, the headphones, and you can make out a lot of the small pieces. I'm not an engineer, so I couldn't begin to tell you what any of those pieces are, but they're fascinating nonetheless. The way Todd McClellan makes these images is he takes them apart in pieces, or in units, I guess you could say. So he'll disassemble. Say he's disassembling the turntable. He'll disassemble the turntable and he'll kind of keep different parts together. So the parts that kind of go on the outside and the parts that are in the next layer down, or the parts that are the guts. And he sort of treats them that way. And then when he begins to lay out the photograph, he'll usually start with, he says he usually starts with the casing first and builds the composition around that. So Todd McClellan went to art school. He's Canadian. He went to art school in Canada, and he works as a commercial photographer, specializing in photography of automobiles. And since he was a kid, he enjoyed taking stuff apart and finding out how things worked and finding out what was inside a thing. So he just kind of extended that love of kind of tinkering with his love of photography and brought the two together in these photographs. So after he takes something apart, he treats it in a couple of different ways, and the exhibition sort of demonstrates that, not in this first group we started with, but in something that we'll look at shortly. So he'll take an object apart, he'll lay it out in this very orderly way, and then he'll photograph it from above. And then he'll take the same object and drop it from a certain height, either using a ladder or scaffolding or something. He'll drop it in sections and photograph it as it's falling. So he's got a very high-speed lens and strobe lights. Photographs it as it's falling in these pieces, and then he layers the photos. And he's always keeping in mind what things look like as they're falling and what they're going to look like as he layers them. So first there's the initial tear down, where he takes the thing apart and lays it out in what some people refer to as a flat lay, and then he does the drop. So he treats most objects in two ways. Not every single thing in the exhibition has both styles represented, but quite a few of them do. This object that we're looking at right now is one of a handful of actual disassembled objects that are included in the exhibition. This is a mantel clock from the 1920s. We also have photographs of it, both laid out and falling. And I was reading an interview with the artist, and one of the things he said is, I believe he said he took this apart and put it back together, took it apart and put it back together a couple of times. And in one of the episodes of taking it apart, one of the springs pushed its way out of the clock and cut his finger before he even knew what was happening. So there was a little safety issue there. But this is one of the mechanical objects he took apart. In more recent years, he's also been taking apart a lot of more technological objects. So iPods, laptop computers, anything that we might use these days that would replace this kind of an object. But what's interesting here too, in an email, I asked him about how he dealt with the acrylic. And he said that he's got the object laid out exactly the way he wants it next to him, and then he has to work very quickly to put it in the acrylic, because as the acrylic sets, it also causes things to move a little bit. So there may be instances where something is not as perfectly straight. I think it's less true of this one than another of the objects. Not as perfectly straight maybe as he would have wanted it to be. But we know this is exactly the same object because there's a little handwritten price on the back of it that says $15 that appears in the photographs of the clock as well. So on the wall next to me, now you can see the two examples of the two ways that he photographs objects that I mentioned before. So first, here on the left is the clock laid out, and I would point out that it is laid out differently than it is in the acrylic, so he changed his mind about that. But again, usually starting with sort of the casing and working from there. Then next to it is the clock falling. So he would have dropped these in groups of components and then layered those images in post-production. So this is kind of an interesting group of images here, because the next to these two images, next to the mechanical clocks, are images of a disassembled flip clock. And I don't know how many of you remember the flip clock, but it's the one that goes tick, 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 tick. It's a technology that's still used today in some train terminals. I think the last time I was abroad, I remember seeing one like that. And so this is that clock that would flip. The numbers would flip as it went to a new time. So this one is from the 1970s, and then they were ultimately replaced by other kinds of digital clocks. But it's kind of interesting to have the mantel clock with the clock face and the hands next to the flip clock with all of the numbers laid out. But again, starting with the casing, like you did in this piece. Hello? Huh? Wrong number. So this was one of the first objects that Todd McClellan photographed, was a rotary phone. And over my shoulder is the rotary phone laid out. I think it was the first item he photographed, and then here it is dropped. But this is this group of images is something that sparked a lot of nostalgia among our visitors and viewers of the exhibition. If you ask somebody who's only known a smartphone, they might be curious to wonder why it's called hanging up when you end a call. Or why is it called dialing when you start a call? There is no dialing involved in a smartphone, it's all pushing of a touch screen. Well, this is why. Many of us will remember dialing a phone. Ooh, that's a good dial on it. Oh, that's a really good dial. Remember the sort of tactile experience of dialing a phone number, and the very tactile experience of slamming down the receiver at the end of a particularly frustrating phone call, or hanging it up. So that's why we call those things what we call them. At any rate, so in front of us we have the falling phone and the laid out phone. An interesting thing about these kinds of telephones, one of our volunteers pointed out to me that the telephones were often owned by the phone company. I remember having to slog the thing back to the phone company at the end of a semester in college. And so it was in their best interest to make sure that the thing was durable. And so this rotary phone today, there's no cracks in the plastic, it's probably from the 70s. I can slam this receiver down and it will not care. So these objects were meant to last. And that's one of the interesting, that's kind of another sub-theme of the exhibition, is objects that were maybe meant to last versus objects that we have today that are sort of throwaway by virtue of their planned obsolescence, more or less. So let's move on now a little bit down the wall and talk about some of the things that have taken the place of a lot of the objects that we've looked at so far. So this is an iPhone 5, and one of my colleagues pointed out to me that this device pretty much takes care of all of the things that the objects pictured in this room and the previous room. In the past, you might have needed all those objects, and today you can do many of those things with one small rectangular device that fits in your pocket. So yeah, of course, iPhones make phone calls. You can type on them if need be. They have timekeeping devices. They have, they hold your music. We talked about that already. We didn't look at the typewriter, but you can type on them. You can play music on them. You can make music on them. So now we have this tiny little device that does all this stuff. Another theme that emerges in this exhibition is just how beautiful these photographs are as art objects. And as I mentioned, Todd McClellan trained as an artist, and that really comes through in the compositions. So I was talking with a group of, I think there were adults and children on MSV Day not too long ago about this composition. And one of the things someone mentioned is how beautifully balanced it is. So in the case of this disassembled Raleigh bicycle, Todd McClellan took the opportunity to use the components to create this very balanced circular rhythm in each corner, and then used the bicycle frame and the diagonals and the horizontals in the bicycle frame to kind of point your eye toward these different circular areas, especially here and here. So he wants your eye to get up here. So he's really using the components of this bicycle almost like pen and ink, or almost like a drawing. So he's drawing with all these components. In contrast to the very circular parts that appear throughout from the wheels and the various gears down here, he's also really exploiting the parts that are more linear and less curvilinear. So we've got, again, the bicycle frame, the strong vertical in the middle, the strong vertical of this component, horizontal components up here. So he's utilizing the elements and principles of design in a very masterful way by creating harmony with the repeated elements and some variety by contrasting the round parts to the more linear parts. So he's really used sort of the tools of the artist to create a masterful design out of all of the things that make up a bicycle. So all of these photographs are essentially the same size, but another interesting sub-theme is that of scale and differences in scale. So we were recently looking at the bicycle and sort of have an idea how big a bicycle is. Well, this is a Swiss Army knife. This is an object that you hold in the palm of your hand. And yet, by disassembling it, laying it out this way, and photographing it from above, it gives this small object this monumental quality because all of the photographs are the same size. Well, thank you so much for joining us today on this quick tour of Things Come Apart here at the Museum of the Shenandoah Valley. I'm Nancy Huth, and now I have to get back to washing my hands, but we'll see you next time.